In an age where kings were seen as God's shadow on earth, one town did the unthinkable. They said no. No to the crown. No to taxes. No to tyranny. And what followed was not just rebellion, but a statement that echoed across medieval Europe. This is the forgotten story of the town that defied its king and dared to survive. For much of the medieval era, the king was not simply a ruler. He was considered chosen by God. His authority was sacred, protected not only by soldiers and laws, but by scripture, sermons, and centuries of tradition. This belief, known as the divine right of kings, placed monarchs above the judgment of common people. To defy a king was not just a crime, which was sin in England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, and beyond. This principle became the backbone of feudal life. From the coronation rituals to the coins stamped with the king's likeness, everything reinforced one idea. The monarch stood at the center of the social and political order. Loyalty wasn't optional, it was expected, enforced, and bred into every class of society. The church played a central role in this system. Bishops and priests, often appointed or approved by the crown, preached loyalty from the pulpit. Latin phrases like Rex Dei Gratia, King by the grace of God, were repeated in royal charters and documents. Monarchs were anointed with holy oil during coronations, a ritual meant to mirror the biblical consecration of kings like Saul and David. Even the rebellious had to reconcile their actions with spiritual consequences. Refusing the king was refusing divine order. Law itself was an instrument of control. Medieval justice favored the monarch's interests. In many kingdoms, the king's courts superseded local customs, gradually centralizing power. Royal judges traveled the countryside, enforcing a legal hierarchy that began and ended with the throne. Resistance wasn't just suppressed through battle, it was legally invalidated economically. Loyalty was built into the very structure of society. Feudalism relied on bonds of land and service. Nobles swore fealty to kings in exchange for territory, and peasants labored on that land under obligations to their lords. Everyone owed something upward. The system rewarded submission and punished independence. A town that paid its taxes and bent the knee might earn protection. A town that resisted risked siege, starvation, and erasure from maps. Throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, European monarchs began strengthening their grip. Henry II of England expanded royal courts. Philip IV of France increased taxation and tightened the crown's hold over the church. Even the Holy Roman emperors, despite internal fragmentation, leaned on the notion that their title carried divine sanction. As monarchs claimed more authority, disobedience became not only harder, it became morally unthinkable. Rebellion, then, was not merely dangerous, it was unnatural. To question the king was to challenge a sacred hierarchy, a cosmic order passed down from heaven to earth. It meant risking excommunication, forfeiture, and execution, not just for leaders, but for entire communities. In this world, obedience wasn't a personal choice. It was a cornerstone of survival. And yet there were places and moments when that fear gave way to defiance. When one town, backed into a corner, decided the price of silence had become greater than the cost of resistance. Nestled at a strategic crossroads between merchant routes and fertile river valleys, the town of Lyon in northern France had, by the early 12th century, become a growing hub of commerce and self-governance. Its location placed it squarely between Flanders and Champagne regions, brimming with trade fairs, wool exports, and cross-continental exchange. With fortified walls and a cathedral rising above timbered rooftops, Leon represented more than just a settlement. It was a medieval city with aspirations. By 1110, Leon had become one of several towns in Europe pushing for greater autonomy. Its merchants were prosperous, its guilds organized, and its citizens increasingly reluctant to submit blindly to the authority of their feudal overlord, the bishop, who also functioned as the royal appointee. Tensions had been building for years. The townspeople resented the corruption and brutality of Bishop Gaudry, a former chancellor to King Philippa. The first Gaudry's rule was marked by heavy taxation, the sale of offices, an open disregard for the grievances of the town's leaders. The citizens of Leon were not peasants. Many were literate. Some had studied canon law. They understood both the risks and the limits of royal power, and they had witnessed a growing trend across the region, towns negotiating charters of liberties from the crown. In nearby communes, like St. Quentin and Noyon, local burghers had gained rights to elect councils, manage markets, and reduce the influence of external lords. Leon's leaders wanted the same, but Bishop Gaudry viewed these aspirations as rebellion in disguise. And the crown saw something else entirely, an opportunity. King Louis VI, known as Louis the Fat, had only recently ascended the throne. Like his predecessors, he was chronically short of funds. His reign would become known for its near-constant need to raise money, both for military campaigns and political stability. A wealthy, restless town like Leon was a source of revenue too valuable to ignore. In 1111, Leon managed to purchase a charter granting communal rights at a cost of 700 livres, a massive sum at the time. For the townspeople, it was a triumph. They believed they had secured legal recognition of their autonomy, but the victory was short-lived. Within a year, Bishop Gaudry, with quiet support from the king, secured an annulment of the charter. The money had been taken, the promise rescinded. Leon had crossed a line. It had challenged the dual authority of church and crown. In response, the king saw a town growing too bold, too wealthy, and too independent. What began as a political dispute over jurisdiction had become a direct confrontation over power. And for a town like Leon, flush with trade, proud of its freedoms, and now humiliated, the question shifted from negotiation to resistance. Not with banners, but with barricades. The moment the crown treated its citizens like subjects, the town saw itself no longer as loyal, but betrayed. In the spring of 1112, tensions in Leon reached their breaking point. The annulment of the town's charter the previous year had left bitterness simmering beneath the surface. Citizens who had believed themselves legally autonomous now found their rights erased by decree. Bishop Gaudry, reinstated with full authority, returned with renewed arrogance and a clear message. Resistance had consequences. What followed wasn't a single decree, but a layered humiliation. First came the reinstatement of the bishop's private guard, funded by new levies imposed directly on the townspeople. These weren't standard tolls or market fees. They were extraordinary taxes on property, trade, and even the brewing of ale. And they weren't approved by the town's elected officials, who, under the brief charter, had functioned as a commune. Those officials had been stripped of power. Some were imprisoned, others fled. Then came the order that tipped the balance. Bishop Gaudry, with the king's silent consent, announced the right to quarter royal troops within private homes without compensation. Soldiers, many of them mercenaries, were placed in the homes of Leon's wealthiest burghers and merchants. Their presence was no accident. It was intimidation. The message was unmistakable. The town would pay in silver or submission. Public spaces turned tense. Marketplaces, once the heart of Leon's trade, were filled with armed patrols. Guild leaders began meeting in private. Church bells that had once summoned people to prayer now rang out warnings of incoming arrests. When 2 outspoken council members were detained on charges of sedition, unrest spread quickly. These weren't radicals. They were known, men respected, educated, and widely seen as moderate. Rumors circulated of yet another tax, this one targeting inheritance rights and land transfers. It meant the crown could seize or heavily fine estates upon death or sale, effectively destroying the financial future of Leon's most productive families. To many, this was not law enforcement, it was extortion. The final insult came during Easter of that year. Bishop Gaudry, presiding over the liturgical celebration, publicly denounced the townspeople from the pulpit, condemning them as disloyal and ungodly. According to contemporary accounts, including a chronicler named Gibbet of Nogent, who lived nearby and documented the uprising, the bishop accused the town's leaders of arrogance, blasphemy, and rebellion against rightful authority. For the people of Leon, it wasn't merely about money anymore. It was about dignity. Their grievances had been dismissed, their rights revoked, their homes violated. The king, far from being a neutral arbitrator, had sided with a corrupt official who treated the town like a personal treasury. In a town that had once believed it could reform itself peacefully, the atmosphere shifted. Banners were no longer symbols of trade guilds, they became rallying points. Secret councils resumed, arms were smuggled, and across Leon an unspoken consensus began to take shape. If the law would not protect them, they would protect themselves. The boiling point had arrived. Not in a battlefield, but in bread markets, in candlelit homes, and in hushed meetings behind locked doors. The rebellion was no longer a question of if, it was a question of when. In the aftermath of Bishop Gaudry's decrees, Leon did not immediately rise in arms. The town's response was deliberate, measured, and rooted in the legal tools it still believed could offer protection. This was not a peasant revolt. It was an organized campaign led by educated men merchants, clerics, and guild leaders who understood both canon law and the shifting political landscape of Capetian France. At the center of the early resistance were figures like Anselm, a respected merchant with close ties to regional trade networks, and Master Robert, a canon sympathetic to the commune's cause. These men, along with other town elders, formed a shadow council that sought to reassert the legitimacy of the 1111 Charter, arguing that its revocation had no legal basis without the consent of those who had paid for it. Their first move was to send a formal petition to King Louis VI, not as rebels, but as loyal subjects. The petition outlined the abuses of Bishop Gaudry in detail: his illegal taxation, the use of soldiers for intimidation, the nullification of a lawfully purchased charter. The language was careful. It did not accuse the king directly. It asked for redress, invoking the royal duty to ensure justice. But the king never replied. It's likely the petition never even reached him. Gaudry's influence at court, and his prior role as royal chancellor, allowed him to intercept or discredit such communications. In the meantime, the bishop's pressure on the town only escalated. Those suspected of organizing resistance faced fines or sudden arrest. One priest who publicly criticized the bishop's policies was excommunicated and later disappeared. Still, the town pressed forward, turning to ecclesiastical law. A delegation traveled to Reims to seek intervention from the archbishop, arguing that Gaudry had violated canon law by using spiritual authority for material gain. But the archbishop, unwilling to challenge a bishop with royal backing, refused to take up their case. Leon's leaders then shifted tactics again, this time to economic resistance. They began secretly withholding portions of the newly imposed taxes. Guilds coordinated efforts to limit trade with estates under Gaudry's control. Bakeries and butchers began charging soldiers higher prices. Inns refused lodging to royal messengers. These were not violent acts, but calculated forms of pressure meant to signal that the town would no longer submit passively. Through it all, the resistance relied on networks of communication. Guild halls served as meeting points. Sermons in sympathetic parishes carried subtle messages of defiance. Letters were smuggled to sympathetic towns in Picardy and Champagne, warning others of the dangers of unchecked episcopal power. By early 1112, it had become clear that negotiation had failed. Every appeal had been blocked, every legal channel closed. The bishop remained unchallenged. The king remained silent, and the town remained under siege economically, spiritually, and physically. Still, Leon had not yet taken up arms. The people waited, but the decision had already been made in practice, if not in name. They would no longer accept edicts. They would no longer bow. When words failed, only one path remained. The crown did not respond with diplomacy, it responded with force. By the summer of 1112, King Louis VI had made his position clear. The town of Leon was not misunderstood. It was insubordinate. A direct summons was issued from the royal court, ordering the leaders of the commune to appear before the king. No protections were offered, no mediators assigned. In medieval legal terms, this was not an invitation, it was a warning. Failing to appear would mark them as outlaws. Appearing could mean imprisonment. Or worse, that Laon single quotes S leaders refused. From the king's perspective, this was no longer a jurisdictional dispute between bishop and town. It was open defiance of royal authority. Louis VI had spent his early reign asserting control over rebellious vassals and lawless barons. Letting a wealthy town dictate its own laws would set a precedent far more dangerous than a single noble's betrayal. A commune that stood independent risked inspiring others. Orders went out to regional lords loyal to the crown. Troops began assembling near Soissons. These were not large royal armies. The French monarchy at the time lacked a centralized military force. But they were enough. A combined force of loyal knights, mercenaries, and episcopal retainers prepared to march. Their objective was not to negotiate. It was to reassert dominance. Bishop Gaudry, now fully aligned with the royal campaign, returned to the king's side. According to chronicler Gibbert of Nogent, who observed events closely, the bishop encouraged swift action, claiming the townspeople had committed sacrilege by resisting their God-appointed superior. His framing was deliberate. If the crown needed moral justification for violence, the bishop was prepared to supply it. In towns across the Allifrance and Picardy, the message spread quickly. The king would tolerate no challenge from within. Communal movements in cities like Amiens and Beauvais had begun to push for similar charters. Now they paused. Council meetings were postponed, petitions quietly withdrawn. If Leon was to be made an example, few were willing to share its fate. Even among Leon's traditional allies, silence prevailed. Merchants who once traded with its markets rerouted their goods. Clergy who had expressed sympathy returned to neutral sermons. The town was not just isolated politically, it was economically and spiritually cornered. Inside Leon, the impact was immediate. Supplies dwindled. News of the incoming force spread through alleyways and marketplaces. Some families packed and fled, others fortified. The commune leaders, now effectively in open rebellion, made no further appeals to the king. The royal message had been received. Submit, and perhaps mercy would follow. Resist, and ruin would come. What Louis XVI did not expect, however, was the scale of the resistance about to unfold. He believed the show of force would be enough, that fear would break the will of a merchant town. But Leon had passed the point of fear. What was coming would not be a rebellion of speeches and parchment. It would be a confrontation, violent, costly, and impossible to ignore. The crown had declared its authority. Now it would be tested. Leon, in early 1112, was no longer a functioning town. It was a fortress under strain. What had begun as a legal protest had become an organized rebellion, and the people inside its stone walls prepared for a siege they knew was coming. The communal bell no longer rang for trade or prayer. It rang for labor. Blacksmiths who once produced horseshoes and tools now turned their furnaces to weapons. Iron was scarce. Plow blades were repurposed into spearheads. Old chains and farming hooks were melted down for reinforcement bars. Armor was rare. Most men would fight with little more than padded tunics and determination. The town walls, originally built to deter bandits and rival towns, were strengthened with makeshift ramparts. Wooden palisades were added above the stone. Barriers, boiling vats were placed along the inner battlements, prepared for defense. The town's gates were braced from within. Outside those walls, fields lay abandoned. Crops were left to rot. Farmers became watchmen. And the people of Leon, merchants, artisans, former clerks, took up arms, not as soldiers, but as defenders of their homes. Food quickly became a central concern. Granaries were inventoried. Cellars were emptied and restocked with salted meat, dried grain, and any remaining reserves. The council imposed rationing. Bakers were ordered to reduce flour use. Cattle were kept inside city walls both for sustenance and to prevent them from being seized by royal forces. No one knew how long the standoff would last. Tensions within the town deepened. Some believed the rebellion had gone too far. Wealthier families with ties to the crown feared confiscation and retribution. Others, emboldened by anger and pride, pushed for full resistance. The communal leadership formed of merchants, guild representatives, and sympathetic clergy struggled to hold unity. Every decision now carried risk: arrest, betrayal, starvation. Within homes, the emotional toll took hold. Families debated whether to stay or flee. Some sent children to nearby villages for safety, though few places remained sympathetic. Letters were sent, but few were answered. Leon's isolation was complete. Religious life became fractured. Priests loyal to bishop Godry were removed or went into hiding. Their replacements, chosen by the town council, delivered sermons centered on justice, not obedience. These were not revolutionaries. They were men trying to hold their community together with scripture, while standing against their own ecclesiastical hierarchy. Fear was constant, but so was resolve. Reports trickled in from travelers that the king's forces were drawing closer. A royal-backed siege was no longer speculation. It was inevitable. Scouts were posted beyond the walls, signal fires prepared. Every citizen was enlisted for duty digging trenches, guarding gates, repairing rooftops. Laon had no standing army. It had no experienced general, but it had something else, a shared memory of betrayal. They had paid for their charter in gold. It had been revoked, their pleas ignored, their homes quartered, their leaders arrested. This wasn't just defiance. It was a defense of their claim to justice. Inside the walls, war wasn't declared in words. It was declared in labor, in silence, in preparation. Laon was no longer a town awaiting mercy. It had become a stronghold bracing for judgment. By April of 1112, Laon was surrounded. King Louis VI had authorized a military response led by forces loyal to both the crown and Bishop Gaudry. While the royal army was still limited in scope during this period of the Capetian dynasty, it was bolstered by local militias, church retainers, and feudal levies from nearby lords. The aim was not to storm the town walls immediately, but to isolate, exhaust, and wait. Laon's defenders had no illusions about what was coming. The town's fortifications, though reinforced, were not designed to withstand prolonged siege. Food stores were limited. There were no external allies marching to relieve them. The strategy from within was clear: hold out as long as possible, hoping for negotiation or royal restraint. But restraint was not on the king's agenda. The siege tightened. Trade routes were blocked. Scouts were captured. Wells outside the walls were sabotaged or poisoned. Small skirmishes erupted near the gates, but the attacking forces avoided direct assault. Their goal was attrition. Inside Laon, the effects were immediate. Bread rationing was cut by half. Meat was restricted to the sick and wounded. Horses were kept alive as long as possible. They were both labor and eventual food. Disease began to spread, especially in the cramped lower quarters of the town. Sanitation collapsed. Fever and dysentery killed more defenders than enemy swords. Tensions mounted among the leadership. A faction within the town council began to argue for surrender. Bishop Gaudry's emissaries had sent messages offering terms: open the gates, hand over the ringleaders, and the rest would be spared. But after months of suffering, trust in royal promises was gone. The memory of the revoked charter remained fresh. So did the bishop's brutality. Then came the turning point, an act not of military precision, but of internal rupture. According to Gibbet of Nogent, a local monk, an eyewitness chronicler, a group of citizens betrayed the defense from within. Motivated by desperation, fear, or private deal-making with the bishop, they allowed a small number of armed men to infiltrate the town through a postern gate. What followed was not an orderly occupation, but a night of chaos. Bishop Gaudry, once driven out, returned under royal protection. But his entry did not bring peace. Violence erupted in the streets. Armed clashes broke out between loyalist forces and enraged townspeople. Several communal leaders were hunted down. One was reportedly killed in the marketplace. Another was dragged from his home and executed on the spot. Then the unthinkable happened. On the morning of April 25th, 1112, a mob overwhelmed the bishop's residence. They broke through his guard and seized Gaudry himself. The man who had ruled Laon through fear and manipulation was cornered, and in an act that defied both king and church, he was murdered by the townspeople. Gibbet of Nogent recounts that his body was mutilated and left unburied for days. This was no longer rebellion. It was regicide in all but name. The siege collapsed into anarchy. Royal forces eventually re-established control, but the damage was done. The town was punished. Communal privileges were abolished. Several leaders were executed or imprisoned. Leon's attempt at self-governance was over at least for the time being. For King Louis VI, the message had to be reinforced. The integrity of royal authority had been challenged by a town. And despite the military response, the final act had not been a royal victory, had been a public assassination. The siege of Leon did not end with surrender. It ended with rupture. It exposed the fragility of centralized power in medieval France and the explosive consequences of betrayal layered upon betrayal. Neither side left the walls untouched, and no king who heard the story could afford to forget what one town had dared to do. The murder of Bishop Gaudry in April 1112 shocked the court of King Louis VI, but it didn't end the crisis in Leon. If anything, it made it more volatile. The royal army re-entered the town, but total control was not immediately re-established. The death of a king's appointed bishop, killed by his own flock, had created a political disaster. The king could not allow such defiance to go unpunished. Yet a prolonged crackdown risked inflaming tensions across other communes, already restless under episcopal control. In the weeks that followed, the royal court faced a dilemma. Leon was effectively leaderless, but its people were not broken. Rebuilding the bishop's authority from outside would be costly and uncertain. And while Louis VI had crushed rebellious nobles before, a full-scale purge of an entire town's population was neither politically viable nor economically wise. So, quietly, intermediaries were sent to Leon, not royal envoys in official robes, but clerks, minor nobles, and abbots with no direct ties to the crown. These figures carried no formal demands, only questions. Would the town recognize royal authority if another bishop less hated than Gaudry were installed? Would the commune disband peacefully if promised reduced penalties? Would names of instigators be handed over in exchange for amnesty? The town's remaining leaders, still shaken by internal betrayal and bloodshed, understood the stakes. They had no army. Their food reserves were depleted, and no other city had risen in their defense. But they also knew the crown wanted this rebellion closed without further spectacle, so they responded, cautiously. Some offered names, mostly of those already dead or missing. Others suggested they would welcome a new bishop, provided he came. Without armed men, no terms were written, no charter reinstated, but the killing stopped. A new bishop, Barthélemy de Jour, was appointed months later. He was known to be more conciliatory, and his arrival marked the beginning of a slow normalization. Trials were held for the most visible participants in the uprising. A few were executed, others were imprisoned. Many disappeared from the historical record. The commune was dissolved, officially declared void by royal decree. But punishment fell selectively. The crown needed stability more than vengeance. For Leon, the price was heavy. It lost its charter, its autonomy, and many of its leaders. But it avoided complete destruction. The town remained a functioning center of trade and administration. The rebellion ended not with triumph or surrender, but with a deal unspoken, struck in the shadows, where neither side claimed victory, and both walked away wounded in the aftermath of Leon's rebellion. The line between justice and revenge blurred almost beyond recognition. Following the assassination of Bishop Gaudry and the collapse of the siege, King Louis VI had to respond decisively. The killing of a bishop, especially one appointed by royal authority, was not a local matter. It was a national crisis. But the king also understood the danger of turning the entire town into martyrs. His response had to be firm but selective. In the summer of 1112, royal commissioners arrived in Leon under guard. Their task was not to negotiate. It was to identify, prosecute, and punish the ringleaders. Dozens were arrested. Trials were held in both ecclesiastical and royal courts. Charges included sedition, sacrilege, and treason. The evidence was often thin, based on rumors, rival testimony, or forced confessions. But the outcomes were never in doubt. Several men were publicly executed. According to chronicler Gibbert of Nogent, at least 2 were hanged in the marketplace where the bishop had been killed. Others were imprisoned or fined. A few were pardoned, mostly those from prominent families who could offer payments or political favors. The town's commune was declared dissolved. Any attempt to restore it would be considered high treason. The church demanded a symbolic penance as well. A memorial service for Gaudry was ordered under royal supervision. Landowners in Leon were required to contribute to the rebuilding of ecclesiastical property damaged during the unrest. The cathedral chapter resumed full authority over spiritual affairs, with the crown's backing. Control was re-established, but not peace. The people of Leon returned to work, to trade, to daily life, but the memory of the uprising lingered. Those who had supported the commune spoke carefully in public. Those who had opposed it avoided scrutiny. Families of executed rebels quietly honored their dead, while others sought favor by aligning more closely with the bishop's new administration. Over time, the rebellion faded from official records, but not from popular memory. For some, the uprising was a shameful act of murder and lawlessness. For others, it became something more. A moment when ordinary people dared to challenge corruption backed by the crown. Leon lost its legal freedom, but it gained a legacy, one that would echo in later urban movements across France. In a world where obedience was survival, Leon had crossed a forbidden line. It paid the price. But it also proved that royal power, though vast, was not unshakable. Not even in a kingdom built on obedience. Leon's rebellion may have ended in blood and silence, but its ripple effects did not vanish with the executions. The uprising of 1112, though crushed, left a mark on the evolving structure of medieval power, and it did not go unnoticed by towns across Europe. In the decades that followed, the idea of urban autonomy gained ground, not through open defiance, but through negotiation, charters, and legal recognition. Cities like Amiens, Saint-Amour, and Beauvais observed what had unfolded in Leon and understood the risks of direct confrontation. But they also saw that the desire for communal self-governance was not unique. It was spreading. By the mid-12th century, across France, Flanders, northern Italy, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, towns began to negotiate for formal liberties rights to elect their own officials, manage taxes, and maintain independent courts. Some were granted royal charters in exchange for loyalty or financial support. Others, like the Italian communes of Florence and Milan, grew strong enough to function almost as city-states. The road to autonomy shifted from revolt to contract, but the root impulse remained the same. Local control over distant authority. Laon became an early symbol of what could happen when the balance tipped too far. Historians and chroniclers, including Gibbert of Nogent, recorded its story not only as a cautionary tale, but as evidence of a growing tension within the feudal order. Royal power was expanding, but so were the ambitions of towns. These conflicts also laid early groundwork for legal reform. Over time, The experience of communal uprisings influenced the development of customary law and administrative practice. Town charters became binding documents. Legal precedents were set. The language of rights once reserved for kings and nobles began to apply, in limited ways, to citizens. Centuries later, in the age of parliaments, revolutions, and declarations of liberty, the questions raised at Leon still echoed. Who holds legitimate power? When does obedience end? And what, if anything, justifies resistance? The people of Leon did not have answers, but they asked the questions at great cost. They stood against a king and a bishop, not to overturn the world, but to govern their corner of it. They failed in the moment, but their defiance became part of a broader arc, the slow, uneven, and often violent emergence of civic autonomy in medieval Europe. History tends to remember kings and conquests, but sometimes it shifts because a town said no.